Secretary of State Powell will present information and intelligence about Iraq's illegal weapons programs, its attempts to hide those weapons from inspectors, and its links to terrorist groups.
The failure of American news media to check government distortion reached new heights when, on the eve of war, the highly respected Secretary of State Colin Powell appeared before the United Nations to make the case that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Saddam Hussein's intentions have never changed. He is not developing the missiles for self-defense. These are missiles that Iraq wants in order to project power, to threaten, and to deliver chemical, biological, and, if we let him, nuclear warheads.
Today, Secretary of State Powell brought the United Nations Security Council the administration's best evidence so far.
After Colin Powell's speech to the UN, immediately the U.S. press applauded with great enthusiasm.
Did Colin Powell close the deal today in your mind for anyone who has yet objectively to make up their mind?
I think for anybody who analyzes the situation, he has closed the deal.
There's irrefutable, undeniable, incontrovertible evidence today. Colin Powell brilliantly delivered that smoking gun today. Colin Powell is outstanding today. I mean, it was lockstep. It was so compelling. I don't see how anybody at this point cannot support this effort.
He made a wonderful presentation. I thought he made a great case for the purpose of disarmament.
It was devastating. I mean, and overwhelming abundance of the evidence. Point after point after point. He just flooded the terrain with data.
It's the end of the argument phase. America has made its case.
The Powell speech has moved the ball.
I think case is closed.
But at the time, it was quite possible to analyze and debunk what he was saying.
Whereas the British press and other international news sources immediately raised legitimate questions about the accuracy of Powell's presentation. The major U.S. news media were virtually silent about the factual basis of his claims, and near unanimous in their praise.
Even the purportedly anti-war New York Times editorialized the next day that Colin Powell had made a sober case, a factual case. One of the great myths and part of the war propaganda cycle is way after the fact to claim that it couldn't have been known at the time that U.S. officials were lying us into war. And in point of fact, it was known at the time and said by many people who were not allowed on the networks, by and large.
One such critical voice belonged to MSNBC's Phil Donahue, one of the few mainstream media commentators who consistently challenged the official storyline coming out of Washington.
We're all now, everybody's righteous. What a terrible Hitler this is. We were mute when he was doing that. He was our SOB.
Absolutely.
And now we're sending our sons and daughters to war to fix that mistake. Doesn't seem fair to me.
Despite being the highest-rated program on MSNBC, Donahue's show was abruptly canceled by the network just 3 weeks before the start of the war.
Phil Donahue was an anti-war voice on MSNBC, one of the cable news channels. And a memo that was leaked as the Donahue show was canceled is very explicit. It said, we don't want this to be a face of NBC as the United States goes into war. This guy puts anti-war voices on our network.
The American people need to know there is no just cause for this war.
But there's no evidence that there is even a weapon that exists in that country yet.
Journalists, too many of them, and some quite explicitly, have said that they see their mission as helping the war effort. And if you define your mission that way, you'll end up suppressing news that might be important, accurate, but maybe isn't helpful to the war effort.
We don't want to have that kind of public persona when then we'd be vulnerable to charges that were unpatriotic. It'll make it more difficult to keep pace with the flag wavers at Fox or CNN or whatever. And more broadly, news media are very worried, not only government pressure, but advertiser pressure, criticism from readers, listeners, and viewers. Gee, our soldiers are in the field, you gotta support them, don't raise these tough questions.
It seems to me that the right thing to do for patriots when American lives are at risk and Americans are dying is to unite behind the troops until victory is won. Now, on this show, Buchanan and Press, we've had a good debate for 8 months on this conflict. But now it seems when the war comes, the debate ends. I think unity, Bill, is essential at this time, or at least when the guns begin to fire.
It's a very effective tactic, at least in the short run, to a large extent, to say, look, you've got to support the troops. You're killing the troops! And that's an effort to conflate supporting the troops with supporting the president's policies.
Once the war against Saddam begins, we expect every American to support our military, and if they can't do that, to shut up.
In addition to Phil Donahue, many other journalists have been silenced for crossing the mythical line known as objectivity.
Today, NBC News fired journalist Peter Arnett this morning for participating in an interview on Iraqi state-controlled television.
Arnett criticized American war planning and said his reports about civilian casualties in the Iraqi resistance were encouraging to anti-war protesters in America.
If you're pro-war, you're objective, but if you're anti-war, you're biased. And often a news anchor will get no flack at all for making statements that are supportive of a war and wouldn't dream of making a statement that's against a war.
I must say I was trying to think of something that would be appropriate to say on an occasion like this, and as is often the case, the best you can come up with is something that Shakespeare wrote for Henry V, wreak havoc and unleash the dogs of war.
And that is a tip-off to just how skewed the media terrain is. We should keep in mind that CNN, which many believe to be a liberal network, had a memo from their top news executive, Walter Isaacson, in the fall of 2001, as the missiles were falling in Afghanistan, telling the anchors and the reporters, you need to remind people, anytime you show images on the screen of the people who are dying in Afghanistan, you've got to remind the American viewers that it's in the context of what happened on 9/11, as though people could forget 9/11.
Where we talked to several people who told us that various friends and relatives had died in the bombing there, in that collateral damage. Nick Robertson, CNN, Kandahar, Afghanistan.
And we would just remind you, as we always do now with these reports from inside the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, that you're seeing only one side of the story, that these U.S. military actions that Nick Robertson was talking about are in response to a terrorist attack that killed 5,000 and more innocent people inside the United States.
Kandahar, and we juxtapose what we're hearing from the Taliban with a live picture of the cleanup that continues in Lower Manhattan. Ground Zero, again, a 24-hour operation that has not ebbed. 5,000 killed that day, back on Tuesday, September 11th, their biggest crime, as civilians going to work that day.
And yet, we know statistically, the best estimates tell us, that more civilians were killed by that bombing in Afghanistan than those who died in the Twin Towers in New York. And the moral objections that could be raised to slaughtering civilians in the name of retaliation against 9/11, those objections were muted by the phrase war on terror, by the way in which it was used by the White House and Congress, and also by the news media.
Free flows of information have been further blocked by a more general atmosphere of contempt for anti-war voices.
Among them are a group called Code Pink, which is headed by Medea Benjamin, who's a terrorist sympathizer, dictator-worshipping propagandist.
The far-left element in America is a destructive force that must be confronted.
Some Americans, sadly, not interested in victory, and yet they want us to believe that their behavior is patriotic. Well, it's not.
What? To call the president stupid, he doesn't know much about anything, that's just great. Go with Danny Glover and Susan Sarandon. You fit in perfect.
To in any way be defending a torturer, a killer, a dictator who used chemical weapons against his own people is pretty remarkable, but it's a very long tradition in the Democratic Party.
Pay no heed to the peaceniks and the left-wing rock stars. They've had their 15 minutes of fame.
These people are essentially useless. They are reflexively opposed to war. It's a principled position, but it's the wrong position, and you can't take them seriously as a strategic voice.
Millions and billions of useless people out there.
If you want to have democracy, you've got to have the free flow of information through the body politic. You can't have these blockages. You can't have the manipulation.
While mainstream journalists have rarely called attention in real time to the failure of news media to provide necessary information and real debate, they have repeatedly pointed to their own failures well after wars have been launched.
During the course of this war, there was a lot of snap to in press coverage. We're at war, the world's changed, we have to root for the country to some extent, and yet it seems something missing from this debate was a critical analysis of where it was taking us.
Those of us in journalism never even looked at the issue of occupation. Because it just didn't occur to it. We weren't smart enough. You'd had to go on against the grain.
Right, you'd also come off as kind of a pointy head trying to figure out some obscure issue here.
Yeah,
it's good guys and bad guys.
Negativism.
News media down the road will point out that there were lies about the Gulf of Tonkin or about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
I'm sorry to say, but certainly television, and perhaps to an extent my station, was intimidated by the administration and its foot soldiers at Fox News.
We should have been more skeptical.
But that doesn't bring back any of the people who've died, who were killed in their own country or sent over by the President of the United States to kill in that country. So after the fact, it's all well and good to say, well, the system worked or the truth comes out. But when it comes to life and death, the truth comes out too late.